Teacher forces student to solve complex equation to mock him, unaware. The boy has genius IQ. Have you ever seen a student sitting quietly at the back of the class and thought he was nothing special? Maybe you're looking, but not really seeing. Brookdale Middle School on the west side of St. Louis, Missouri, where early autumn covers the schoolyard in a carpet of golden maple leaves. In math class 204, the seat in the very back by the window always belonged to one person, Ezra Jones, 14 years old. Ezra didn't speak much. He never raised his hand, never made noise. To teachers, he was the type of student labeled as hard to reach, marked down with the phrase, lacks engagement. To his classmates, Ezra was almost invisible. He wasn't part of the popular crowd, and certainly not someone anyone paid attention to. But that was only true if you looked at the surface. Inside his worn-out backpack was a notebook with frayed corners. Inside it were not just 8th grade assignments, but also differential equations, Laplace transforms, and even Fourier series that Ezra had copied from a textbook borrowed at the St. Louis Central Library, where he spent almost every Saturday afternoon. No one knew that this quiet boy had rewritten entire systems of theorems from a college-level textbook just to test himself. And no one asked how Ezra could solve a 3-variable inequality system, purely from memory. Ezra learned quickly, but not to show off. He learned because the world of mathematics made him feel safe. No one there mocked silence. No one made him speak loudly just to be heard. He didn't need anyone's approval. But things were about to change, because soon, in the middle of a noisy classroom, Ezra would be dragged out of the quiet corner he always hid in, to face a math problem not meant to teach, but to humiliate. And just when the class thought Ezra would lower his head, he would make them look up. If you've enjoyed this story so far, take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the exciting, powerful stories we have coming next. Ms. Amelia Martin, 39 years old, was a veteran math teacher at Brookdale Middle School. A valedictorian graduate in mathematics education from the University of Missouri-Columbia, she had once been the youngest in the school's history to be officially appointed as a full-time teacher after just 18 months of internship. After nearly 2 decades of teaching, she was confident she could read a student within the first 3 weeks of the school year. In Ms. Martin's view, a classroom was a place of order, structure, and everything had to operate under disciplined logic. Her desk always had a countdown timer, lesson plans broken down minute by minute, and if a student forgot their Casio FX 115ES calculator, they had to do their work by hand, as a form of deterrent punishment. To her, initiative was a sign of seriousness, while silence was a sign of laziness. That's why Ezra Jones, the quiet student, rarely speaking up, often staring out the window, was a thorn in Ms. Martin's side. Even though Ezra always submitted assignments on time and rarely made mistakes, his lack of enthusiasm in class, to her, was a sign of passive defiance. What irritated her even more was the latest test. The class average was 61.5, 15 points below the school's benchmark. But Ezra, that distracted boy, scored 100%. For the 3rd time in a row. Not a single error, not a single correction mark. Ms. Martin couldn't explain it. And that's what bothered her most. Anything she couldn't control was always a threat. On that Tuesday morning, after handing back the graded tests, Ms. Martin stood at the front of the room, arms folded, eyes sweeping across each student's face. "This class is slipping," she began, her voice not loud, but sharp as a blade. "I'm not here to let you scrape by. I teach so you can get into honors math in high school. And if you don't make an effort, no one's going to save you." Every gaze dropped, except for one, looking out the window. Ms. Martin paused, eyes narrowing as she noticed Ezra leaning on his hand, eyes following a squirrel sprinting along the edge of the schoolyard fence. Ezra Jones. The whole class turned. Ezra flinched, straightening up reflexively. Yes, ma'am. What's out there that's more interesting than hearing about how this class is failing? Snickers broke out from the front rows. Ezra remained silent. Ms. Martin didn't let go. If you're not interested in basic lessons, then let's try something more challenging. Up here. Now. Ezra stood, walking from the back row to the front. The squeak of his rubber soles echoed against the tile floor, every step stretching into eternity. Ms. Martin turned, picked up a marker, and wrote an equation on the board. Not from their current unit, but a 3-variable system with logical constraints, something she'd used last year in the math club for 10th graders. She finished writing, then turned back. Here. Prove to me you're not just staring out a window all day. Ezra looked at the board. The room fell silent. One student whispered, Ms. Martin's killing him right now. Another chuckled. Bet he doesn't even know where to start. Room 204 at Brookdale Middle School fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint tapping of pens on desks and the slow whirring of the ceiling fan. Ms. Martin stood near the board, her gaze sharp as a laser fixed on Ezra Jones, the student she believed needed a lesson in humility and effort. No one knew that the math problem she was about to write didn't belong in the official 8th grade curriculum. She slowly walked to the edge of the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and began writing. Solve the following system of equations. Xo squared plus y plus z equals 12. 2x minus y plus 3z equals 5. X plus 4y minus z equals 8. 3 lines. 3 variables. A quadratic equation. No student in the class had ever seen this kind of problem, at least not without hints. Ms. Martin finished writing, set the marker down on the desk, and turned around. This is an expanded system of equations. I believe, if you're smart enough to ignore my lessons, then surely you're smart enough to solve this. The class stirred. A student in the front row whispered to a friend beside him, Isn't this like a challenge question for the 10th grade math team? Another smirked. She's really going hard. Ezra stood at the board, marker in hand. His fingers trembled slightly, not because of the math, but because of the eyes fixed on him, as if waiting for a train wreck. In Ezra's mind, the system appeared as a complex but fascinating logic puzzle. He had solved tougher ones, in the notebook no one else had ever read. But standing in front of the class, surrounded by skepticism and whispers of doubt. Starting wasn't so easy. A boy's voice behind him said clearly, He doesn't even know what he's doing. A few quiet chuckles broke out in the room. Ms. Martin stood with her arms crossed, like a judge waiting for a guilty verdict. You don't have to solve it all. Just show me you know how to begin. Her tone sharpened, piling on more pressure. But Ezra said nothing. He stared at the board, thinking in silence. And then, something shifted. Room 204 was still bathed in sunlight. The pale golden light of autumn streamed through the row of windows, casting long beams across the tiled floor like the ruled lines of a giant notebook. Ezra Jones stood silently in front of the board. His right hand held a marker, his left gently clutched the hem of his uniform shirt. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. Behind him, the whispering began to rise, growing clearer by the second. He doesn't even know how to factor. Let's see if he just stands there like a statue again for 5 minutes. Class is almost over. Martin should give him a 0. A group of 3 students in the second row giggled. One tapped the tip of his pen on the desk, pretending to count down to the embarrassing end of the lesson. Ezra didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the board. The question wasn't, is this problem too hard? It was. Could he stay calm enough to solve it under the gaze of an entire room waiting for him to fail? He took a deep breath, slow and steady. And in that moment, Ezra noticed something small, but grounding. A beam of sunlight slanting across the whiteboard, forming a perfect triangle, as if the universe itself was reminding him, where there is structure, there is logic, and where there is logic, he could find control. He began to write, not hastily, not shakily, just clean lines, precise, without a single erasure. Step 1. Let x squared equals a step 2. Convert the system into variables Z. Step 3. Solve the 3-variable system using the algebraic addition method. Behind him, silence unexpectedly fell. The giggles faded like flames deprived of oxygen. A girl in the front row tilted her head, watching Ezra's work closely, then murmured, "Wait, is he using linear inverse substitution?" Her friend squinted. I think he is." Ezra's hand moved faster. Each step he wrote pulsed with clarity and rhythm. His mind no longer registered the scraping chairs, the snickering. Only the voice of logic remained, of numbers, of what he called the only language that never betrays. At the teacher's desk, Ms. Martin began to step closer. Her expression remained composed, but her lips pressed into a tight line. In over 15 years of teaching, she had seen gifted students. But she had never seen an 8th grader solve a quadratic 3-variable system using matrix structure analysis. Ezra didn't solve like a student. He solved like someone who had once designed the very question. At the back of the room, the boy who had laughed earlier was silent now. The pen in his hand hovered mid-air as if he meant to write something, but gave up. The eyes in the room began to change, from mocking to bewildered to utterly focused. The black marker in Ezra Jones's hand didn't just write a solution. Each stroke carved a new definition of what it meant to be a quiet genius. On the first line, he introduced a substitution. Let a equal x squared. A simple transformation. But for an 8th grader, it was uncharted territory. On the second line, he substituted AI into the first equation and reorganized the system of 3 variables into a linear form that was easier to solve. On the third line, he drew branching arrows, a visual mapping technique usually used by mathlete students training for district or state competitions. On the fourth, he broke the system down into a 3x3 matrix and applied row operations, specifically adding the first and third rows to eliminate a variable. Every step was not only correct, but so clear it felt like a real-time demonstration of thought visualization software unfolding on the whiteboard. The classroom remained dead silent. No one dared whisper. All eyes were locked on the board, watching each line as if witnessing a magic trick. But this wasn't magic. It was pure intellect. A girl in the second row on the right, Madison, leaned toward her friend and whispered, "He's not just solving it. He's basically teaching the class." Her friend nodded, eyes still fixed on the board. And he's not using scratch paper. It's like his brain is the calculator. Ezra kept going. As the algebraic operations reduced the system to its simplest form, he transitioned smoothly into back substitution. The entire whiteboard was now covered in clean, aligned, razor-sharp strokes. In the top right corner, he boxed the final answers. X equals 2, equals 3u, Z equals 1, Miss Mrs. Martin stood 3 steps away, no longer with arms crossed. She had stepped closer, her eyes tracking each line he wrote, chalk in hand. but she didn't add a single mark. She had once been a judge for Missouri's state-level math competitions. She knew the difficulty of this problem. More than anyone, she understood. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. The class seemed to hold its breath. A boy in the back, the same one who had laughed the loudest earlier, now only murmured to himself, "I didn't even understand the first step. And he's already done." Ezra stood still in front of the board. No turning around. No smile. No, "Did I get it right?" He didn't need validation. He knew he was right. A round of applause broke out, soft at first but sincere. Then it spread. Madison was the first to clap. Then the group that had mocked him. Eventually, the entire room 204 came alive, as if everyone had just witnessed something rare. The presence of a true genius, standing quietly among them. Ms. Martin exhaled slowly. She turned to the class. "What did you just witness?" "Not a miracle. Not a chance." She looked at Ezra. "This is real ability, and the focus I once thought you didn't have." Ezra nodded slightly, not to boast, but as a silent thank you. That evening, in the small kitchen of a second-floor apartment in Northwood Park, a northern suburb of St. Louis, a soft yellow light bathed the worn wooden dining table in a quiet, familiar glow. Ezra Jones sat between his parents, one hand still clutching his old notebook, the other twirling a pen between his fingers. He had just finished a school day unlike any other in his life. His mother, Lorraine Jones, paused mid-motion while spooning green beans onto a plate. Her gaze drifted from the stew pot to her son. "You seem different today," she said, half curious, half concerned. Ezra looked up and smiled gently. Not the kind of smile he used to hide things, but a real one. The kind that comes from someone who has just realized they no longer need to hide. His father, Michael Jones, a tall black man with seasoned eyes and weather-worn hands, from nearly 2 decades at the local machine shop, set his spoon down and tilted his head, waiting. Ezra took a deep breath, then spoke. "Today, Miss Martin called me to the board." His mother's eyes twitched slightly. "Again?" "Because you were staring out the window." Ezra shook his head. "Number this time, it was a math problem. She thought I couldn't solve it. But I did." The whole class went silent. Then they clapped. Silence followed for 3 seconds. Michael gave a slow, deliberate nod. He said nothing. He simply placed his hand on his son's shoulder, a rough, warm, weighted hand, as if everything he wanted to say had been wrapped into that single gesture. Ezra's mother wiped her glasses with the edge of her shirt and said without looking at anyone, "I knew. I always knew." Ezra looked at her. For the first time, he saw not just belief in her eyes, but relief, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. After dinner, while his parents cleaned up, Ezra remained at the table, staring at the notebook he had once treated as a place to hide. But tonight, instead of writing another solution to a math problem, he flipped to the first blank page and wrote 3 bold lines. Goal: Math Olympiad. Spring 2025. Apply for the District Advanced STEM program. Share what I know, even if they don't ask. He wrote slowly, deliberately, as if making a promise to himself. Outside the window, a breeze rustled by, flipping the page to the right, revealing formulas long written, where dreams had once been tucked away in margins. His father came back in, seeing Ezra still sitting there, pen in hand, eyes distant. He didn't interrupt. He only asked quietly, "You thinking about going far?" Ezra pressed his lips together, then nodded. "Not just thinking. I believe I need to." Michael smiled, not because he was surprised, but because that answer hadn't come from a boy anymore. It came from someone starting to understand who they were. Before bed, Ezra's mother stopped by his room. She handed him a wrinkled folder. "This is the application for the district's advanced math program. I printed it last year. I think you can submit it now." Ezra took it, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but because he knew. The door he once thought wasn't meant for him had begun to open. Monday morning, 7:15 a.m., Ezra Jones arrived at the St. Louis District Gifted Student Center, located at 4925 Hillside Avenue, a two-story building of gray brick and large glass windows overlooking Mapleview Park. The sign at the gate bore a bold inscription, "Where different minds find their own way." Ezra tightened the strap of his backpack. Today, he wasn't just here to study math. Today, he was here to prove he belonged. Room 204A, the district's advanced mathematics class, was a universe entirely different from Brookdale. There was no idle chatter, no dismissive glances, only whiteboards filled with extended equations, a hanging Fibonacci spiral model, and 21 of the district's top students from 12 public schools, selected through test scores and a special qualifying exam. The instructor was Ms. Ivy Holcomb, 32, a former member of the National Math Counts team who had taught at MIT before returning home to build stronger foundations. She entered the room without introducing herself. Instead, she wrote on the board, "Prove. Let z be a complex number such that the absolute value of z is equal to 1. Show that the real part of z to the power of I forms a bounded real sequence." Then she turned to face the class. "Whoever solves this first within 30 minutes will be this semester's team lead." Ezra looked at the board. He had read this type of problem in a paper by Professor Roger Cook, but had never worked through it himself. He felt excitement, not fear. 10 minutes passed. A girl named Rena from Clayton North wrote 5 lines and erased them. The boy next to Ezra, wearing thick glasses, kept flipping through his book. Ezra just stared at the board. Then he opened his notebook and wrote, "Z equals cos theta plus I times sin theta implies z to the power of n equals cos of n theta plus I times sin of n theta implies real of z to the power of n equals cos of n theta, bounded in the interval -1 to 1 for all theta." In under 11 minutes, he walked up to the board. He didn't speak. He simply rewrote the proof by hand, complete and clear, then drew a double line beneath the letters QED. The room went silent. Ms. Holcomb looked at him, then smiled. "Your name?" "Ezra Jones, Brookdale School." No one knew Brookdale, but from that moment on, the name Ezra Jones began to circulate. In the first week, Ezra solved 5 out of 6 advanced problems, while the class average was 2.8. By the second week, he became one of only 3 students to crack a complex number sequence problem that had stumped last year's entire cohort. By the third week, when an older student asked Ezra how to rewrite the gamma function in polar coordinates, Ezra not only explained it, he simplified it with a diagram so clear that the group photographed the board. Ezra didn't speak often, but when he did, everyone listened. At lunch, he usually sat with a group of 4. Rena, the girl from Clayton, who loved game theory. Tyrell, the only other black student besides Ezra, who had won a state-level geometry award. June, of Korean descent, obsessed with cryptography and creator of a chatbot that solved equations. And Ezra, the only newcomer, yet the one who could turn abstract concepts into navigable maps. For the first time, he didn't feel different. For the first time, he didn't have to try to fit in. He just had to be himself. March. The early cherry blossoms began to bloom across the campus of Brookdale Middle School, bringing with them a strange, almost unfamiliar sense of renewal. And no one felt it more clearly than those in math class 204. Ever since Ezra Jones returned from his first term at the St. Louis District Gifted Center, everything had changed. He was still the quiet boy, still sat in the last row, still opened that worn-out notebook, now reinforced with 2 extra covers to keep it from tearing. But what was different was this. The eyes that once avoided him now sought him out. During break time, groups of students began approaching Ezra's desk. "Hey, can you help me with this system of inequalities?" "Ezra, the other day you mentioned something about extended periodic functions. I didn't get it. Could you explain again?" Ezra wasn't irritated, wasn't dismissive. He was patient, encouraging, never made anyone feel lesser for asking. Instead of teaching, he simply shared. One early weekday afternoon, as Ezra was walking 2 classmates through inverse logarithmic transformations, Ms. Martin stood silently at the classroom door. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just smiled, a smile far softer than her usual stern expression. At the monthly faculty meeting, Ms. Martin stood up and spoke. "I used to think that the students who spoke the most were the most engaged. But now I understand. There are kids who speak through their actions, through their results, and through the quiet example they set. We must learn to listen, even to silence." From that moment on, in room 204, the mandatory participation rule before every quiz was removed. Students were encouraged to demonstrate their strengths in ways that fit their personality, and Ezra became the living proof of that principle. By mid-April, during a special flag ceremony, the principal stepped onto the podium, holding a letter marked with the red seal of the Missouri State Department of Education. His voice rang out clearly. "We are honored to announce that student Ezra Jones has been selected as the official representative of Brookdale at the Missouri Federal Gifted Student Conference, to be held this May in Jefferson City." Applause erupted, at first sparse, then spreading like a wave across the school courtyard. Madison, Ezra's classmate, was the first to rise. Then Ty, then Jordan, and finally, the entire Class 204 stood together. Ezra stepped onto the stage, eyes forward, footsteps steady. He took the microphone. Not dramatic, not loud, just a voice, calm and sincere. "I used to think I should stay silent. Because when you're different, the easiest thing to do is disappear. But maybe the right thing is to show people why you're different, not to prove anything, but to remind them. There are many ways to shine, and silence is one of them." The day Ezra boarded the bus to Jefferson City, all of Class 204 came to the gate to see him off. Ms. Martin handed him a small envelope. "Inside is an invitation, if you're willing, to be next year's student teaching assistant. Not because you're the best," she said, "but because you make others believe they could be their best, too." Ezra didn't answer right away. He just nodded, smiled, and stepped onto the bus. Late May afternoon, the sky over St. Louis was bathed in golden sunset light. Classroom 204 of Brookdale Middle School was no longer as noisy as usual. Scattered across the room, some students were finishing their final exams. Others were quietly reading or chatting in low voices. At the back desk, the silent corner for nearly a year, Ezra Jones sat, eyes gazing out through the slightly open window. A light breeze fluttered the pages on his desk, revealing a pencil-written line in neat script. "Don't try to disappear, when the only thing this world still lacks is you." He had written that the night before heading to the Missouri State Gifted Student Conference, where he shared his experience of learning mathematics through reverse geometric thinking and spatial intuition, in front of more than 200 students, and faculty from across the state. The boy who once bowed his head in shame now spoke on a large stage with the calm of someone who had walked through storms of prejudice. Ezra closed his eyes for a moment. Memories, vivid and unchanged, filled his mind. The day Ms. Martin called him to the board with the intention of humiliating him. The laughter, the doubtful stares, his slow, clean solution, and the sudden silence in the classroom. Ms. Martin stepped closer, reading each line of his work and remaining silent for a long while before speaking. Then he remembered the day he helped his classmates review for the algebra test. A week earlier, during an afternoon study session, 12 students had asked Ezra to explain solving quadratic equations using the method of completing the square. Ezra had divided the board into 3 sections, organized the class into small groups, and even designed a logic puzzle game, all within 15 minutes. At the end of the session, Madison said something he'd never forget. "You're not just smart. You make me want to be smarter, too." Almost unconsciously, Ezra looked toward the teacher's desk. Ms. Martin was packing up her materials, but her eyes occasionally flicked in his direction. Since his return from the conference, she had treated quiet students very differently. No more mandatory speaking to earn participation points, and instead, she encouraged written reflections, diagrams, or visual thinking when needed. She had said in the most recent staff meeting, "We can't expect every child to shine the same way. Some are like candles, flaring brightly through their words. Some are like oil lamps, quietly burning through the night. And we need both." The bell rang. Students poured out of the classroom. Ezra sat there for one more minute. Then he closed his notebook, now filled with equations, proofs, personal notes, and quotes from the past year, and placed it in his backpack. But before leaving the room, he wrote a small line on the whiteboard at the back of the class, where Ms. Martin usually posted weekly questions. "Not everyone who is silent is weak. Sometimes the quietest one is thinking the farthest ahead." Ezra stepped into the hallway. The afternoon sun slanted across the old cement steps, casting everything in gold. A soft breeze brushed against his uniform collar. Everything looked the same, but Ezra was no longer the same boy. Though once underestimated and deliberately humiliated, Ezra Jones had proven that true strength doesn't need to be loud. He didn't just change how others saw him, he changed how an entire school treated its quietest students. Ezra's story is a reminder. Sometimes the one most overlooked is the one who makes the greatest difference. Thank you for following this story. Be sure to like and subscribe to Black Strength Stories so you don't miss the next inspiring journey.